The Cathars were a Christian dualist or Gnostic movement that thrived in southern France in the Languedoc region. This was during the 12th and 13th century. They presented a significant challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church and were ultimately suppressed through a brutal crusade. And this is a subject that has been asked for many times. So here we go. Cathar communities were often known for their industriousness and peaceful nature. This made them valuable assets to local lords who benefited from their economic contributions and stability. Their emphasis on equality and their rejection of ordered ranks appealed to those who felt marginalized by the feudal system. They offered a sense of community and belonging, particularly for women, who were often given greater roles in Cathar communities than in the Catholic Church. The tolerance and even support that the Cathars received from some local nobles in the Languedoc region was a crucial factor in their ability to thrive. Unlike northern France, where the monarchy was more powerful, the Languedoc region was characterized by a decentralized feudal system. Local lords held significant autonomy and often resisted interference from the French crown. Some nobles saw the Cathars as potential allies in their efforts to maintain their independence. By protecting Cathar communities, they could gain support against external threats, both political and religious. A prime example is Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, one of the most powerful nobles in the region. While not a Cathar himself, he was sympathetic to their cause and offered them protection, partly due to his own conflicts with the Church and the French crown. The Cathars' rejection of Catholic sacraments stemmed from their dualistic worldview. They considered the sacraments to be material rituals performed by a corrupt church incapable of delivering true spiritual grace. For example, they rejected the Eucharist because they saw the bread and wine as material substances, not the literal body and blood of Christ. They saw baptism with water as a meaningless material ritual. They rejected marriage as a form of procreation, which they viewed as a tool of the demiurge. The consolamentum, their central ritual, was a spiritual baptism administered by the perfecti, and the perfecti were considered the perfect ones. They were the spiritual elite of the Cathar community. And this baptism was believed to liberate the soul from the material world and prepare for its return to the good God. The Cathars' emphasis on equality and their criticism of the Church's wealth and corruption resonated with some nobles who were also critical of the Church's excess. The Languedoc region was known for its relative religious tolerance with a history of accommodating various faiths and sects. This environment made it easier for the Cathars to establish communities and gain support. Many people in the Languedoc region, including some nobles, were dissatisfied with the Catholic Church, criticizing its corruption, wealth, and perceived hypocrisy. This dissatisfaction made them more open to alternative religious movements like the Cathars. And it's also important to note that not all nobles in the Languedoc region supported the Cathars. Some were devout Catholics and actively opposed the heresy. The medieval period was marked by significant social and economic inequality. The Church's wealth and power often reinforced this inequality, fueling resentment among the lower classes. The Cathars' message of equality and their criticism of the Church's materialism found fertile ground among those who felt marginalized and oppressed. The Cathar movement was part of a broader trend of religious dissent in the 12th and 13th century. Various groups challenged the Church's authority and sought alternative forms of spiritual expression, and this atmosphere of dissent created an environment where the Cathars could thrive. Many people within the Church itself recognized the need for reform. However, efforts at reform were often met with resistance from the hierarchy. This frustration with the Church's inability to reform itself further fueled the appeal of the Cathars. The medieval Church was often perceived as corrupt and materialistic, with wealthy clergy and elaborate rituals. This disillusioned many who sought a more authentic spiritual path. The Church's accumulation of wealth, the lavish lifestyles of some clergy, and the practice of buying and selling of the church offices, bribery or simony, created a perception of corruption and hypocrisy. This eroded the Church's moral authority and fueled discontent among those who sought a more authentic spiritual path. The perceived moral failings of some Catholic clergy, including sexual misconduct, greed, and abuse of power, further tarnished the Church's image. This reinforced the Cathars' criticisms and made their calls for reform more appealing. The Church's rigid hierarchical structure, with its emphasis on obedience and control, alienated many who sought a more personal and direct connection to the divine. The Cathars' less ordered systems and emphasis on spiritual equality offered a welcome alternative. The Cathars effectively exposed the perceived hypocrisy of the Church, highlighting the inconsistencies between its teachings and its practices. This resonated with those who were already dissatisfied with the church's authority. The Cathars' simpler rituals and less complex church structure provided a more accessible and relatable path to spiritual growth. This appealed to those who felt overwhelmed or excluded by the elaborate rituals and hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. The Cathars emphasized direct spiritual experience and personal responsibility for salvation, and this resonated with those who sought a more authentic and meaningful connection to the divine. This posed a direct challenge to the Catholic Church's authority, both spiritual and temporal. The Church saw the Cathars as heretics who were undermining its doctrines and attracting followers away from its fold. The Cathars' core belief in dualism, with its good and evil gods, directly contradicted the Church's fundamental monotheistic doctrine of a single, all-powerful God. This challenged the very basis of Christian theology as understood by the Church. The Cathars rejected the validity of the Church's sacraments, including baptism, the Eucharist, and marriage. They saw these roles as material and corrupt, incapable of conveying true spiritual grace. This undermined the Church's claim to be the sole mediator of divine grace and salvation. The Cathars offered an alternative path to salvation through the consolamentum, their spiritual baptism, and the pursuit of inner purity. This challenged the Church's authority to define the terms of salvation and control access to heaven. The Cathars also criticized the feudal system and the power of the nobility, which was closely intertwined with the Church. This challenged the established social order and the Church's role in maintaining it. The Cathars' community-based structure, with its emphasis on equality and shared decision-making, contrasted sharply with the Church's hierarchical and centralized organization. This challenged the Church's authority to govern and control its followers. The Cathars also refused to pay tithes and other church dues, depriving the Church of significant financial resources. This threatened the Church's economic power and its ability to maintain its institutions. The Cathar communities often practiced communal living and economic self-sufficiency, presenting an alternative economic model that challenged the Church's control over resources. The Cathars gained support from some local nobles in the Languedoc region, who saw them as a way to resist the encroaching power of the French monarchy and the Church. This threatened the Church's political alliances and its ability to influence secular rulers. With the Cathars' growing popularity, it led to a significant loss of followers for the Catholic Church. This threatened the Church's power base and its ability to maintain its influence. The Cathar movement's spread demonstrated the Church's inability to control the religious landscape and enforce its doctrines. This challenged the Church's authority and its claim to universal dominion. So Pope Innocent III sought to assert his authority over all Christendom, and he saw the Cathar heresy as a direct challenge to his power and was determined to eliminate it. Earlier attempts to peacefully convert the Cathars back to Catholicism largely failed. The Church felt more forceful measures were necessary. Pierre de Castelnau was a French ecclesiastic and papal legate. He was appointed by Pope Innocent III to address the Cathar heresy in southern France. Castelnau was murdered on January 15, 1208, near Saint-Gilles. While the exact circumstances of his death were debated, Pope Innocent III blamed Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who was sympathetic to the Cathars. This event served as the immediate trigger for the Albigensian Crusade. Northern French nobles saw the Crusade as an opportunity to expand their territory and wealth by conquering the prosperous Languedoc region. The Crusade offered a chance for land grabs and political advancement. The French monarchy under King Philip II also saw the Crusade as a way to consolidate its control over the Languedoc region, which had a history of independence. The Crusade provided a pretext for military intervention and the eventual annexation of the region. There were significant social and economic tensions between northern and southern regions of France. While the north was more feudal and hierarchical, the south was more urban and commercially developed, and the Crusade provided an outlet for these tensions. The Albigensian Crusade was led by Simon de Montfort. It was marked by extreme violence and massacres, with crusaders often indiscriminately killing Cathars and non-Cathars alike. This brutality was fueled by religious fanaticism, the desire for plunder, and a general disregard for human life. The sack of Béziers, where an estimated 20,000 souls perished, stands as a horrifying testament to the Crusade's brutality, revealing the Crusaders' unyielding resolve to achieve their objectives at any human cost. The Crusade involved the destruction of Cathar communities, the burning of books, and the persecution of those who refused to recant their beliefs. This destruction aimed to eradicate not only the Cathar faith, but also the social and cultural structures that supported it. The Inquisition, which was established to root out heresy, also played a crucial role in the suppression of Catharism. Formally established in 1233, the Inquisition provided a legal and institutional framework for the persecution of Cathars. It wasn't just mob violence anymore. It was systematic and sanctioned by the Church. The primary goal was to identify, interrogate, and punish anyone suspected of heresy. The Inquisition involved a vast network of informers, investigators, and tribunals. They used torture, intimidation, and surveillance to force confessions and recantations. Just to give you a couple of examples, they used the strappado, where they suspended people by their wrists, often with weights attached. They did waterboarding in the rack, where they stretched the body. And they targeted not only Cathar perfecti, but also those who were suspected of harboring or supporting them. The Inquisition created an atmosphere of fear that helped to destroy the Cathar movement. Beyond the physical torture, inquisitors employed psychological manipulation such as threats against family members, property, and social standing. They also used isolation, where they kept prisoners in solitary confinement to break their will. And then they also used false promises by offering leniency in exchange for confessions and betrayals of others. The vast network of spies and informers kept tabs on communities and reported any suspicious activity or utterances. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust, and those found guilty of heresy, even if they recanted, were often subjected to public penances, such as wearing distinctive clothing or being whipped, and this served as a warning to others. Among the targets of the Inquisition were the Cathar perfecti, the spiritual leaders of the Cathar. Their elimination was crucial to dismantling the movement. Any suspected sympathizers were targets as well. Then this included anyone that was suspected of harboring, aiding, or even sympathizing with Cathars. This included family members, friends, and neighbors. The Inquisition really feared the practice of endura, where a Cathar who believed that they were close to death would refuse food and water. They would essentially starve themselves to death. And this was seen as a defiant act of martyrdom, and the Inquisition went to great lengths to prevent it. The Inquisition's methods created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. People were afraid to speak freely, associate with suspected heretics, or even express doubts about the Church. This effectively silenced dissent and stifled the Cathar movement. By targeting not just the perfecti, but also their supporters, the Inquisition destroyed the social fabric of Cathar communities. People were turned against each other, families were torn apart, and trust was eroded. The Inquisition's relentless pursuit of heresy, combined with the violence of the Crusade, ultimately succeeded in suppressing the Cathar movement, and by the early 14th century, organized Catharism had been effectively eradicated. Beyond the immediate destruction, the Inquisition left deep scars on the Languedoc region. The trauma of torture, betrayal, and the loss of loved ones lingered for generations. The constant surveillance and suspicion created a culture of fear and self-censorship that stifled intellectual and spiritual exploration. The region's once vibrant cultural life was diminished, and a sense of collective trauma cast a long shadow over its history. Even after the overt prosecution ended, the psychological and social wounds inflicted by the Inquisition continued to shape the region's identity. The Inquisition's methods also represented a profound perversion of the Christian faith. The use of torture, intimidation, and violence in the name of God stood in stark contrast to the teachings of Jesus, who preached love, compassion, and forgiveness. The Inquisition's actions undermined the moral authority of the Church and tarnished its image. It also raised troubling questions about the relationship between faith and power, and the potential for religious institutions to become instruments of oppression. The Cathar persecution serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of safeguarding individual conscience and freedom of belief. The suppression of the Cathars had a profound impact on the history of southern France, and this led to the decline of its unique culture and the consolidation of French royal power. It also highlighted the dangers of religious intolerance and the use of violence in the name of faith.